Last time we covered 25 of the 40 monsters that the Scooby-Doo Show has to offer. I'm no mathematician, but if my back of the napkin calculations are right, then that means we have 15 monsters left to work through. The Gator Ghoul, the 10,000 volt ghost, the Headless Horseman, the ghost of Dr. Coffin, the No-Face Zombie, Ramps the Vamp, the Pterodactyl Ghost, the Phantom Racer, the Futuristic Monster, the Tar Monster, Old Iron Face, the Cat Creature, the Moon Monster, the Ghostly Gondolier, and the Beast of Bottomless Lake. Any one of these baddies could be the grand winner, so cast your vote as we determine once and for all which is the scariest monster in the Scooby-Doo Show. Welcome to Singularity. Let's start with a fun one. I love the futuristic monster from Creepy Cruise. If you missed this episode, it's a really unique one. Professor Von Clamp has created a working time machine, and during a demonstration for prospective investors, the machine malfunctions and summons a monster from 5,000 years in the future, just called the Futuristic Monster. Man, it would have been so easy to just go with some cheesy sci-fi robot or monster for this. And you could argue that that's exactly what they did. At the end of the day, despite being our first example of an insectoid monster, something I talked about more last time with the mantis, it's nothing special. I mean, it works, but it's no Space Kook or Phantom Shadow. No, what really works here is the existential terror of the episode. 5,000 years in the future, and this bug-eyed bigwig is all we see? What happened to all the people? Is this a mutation of a terrestrial creature or an invader from the stars? What has happened in the intervening 5 millennia that this monstrosity is the greeting committee? That's a type of dread that Scooby-Doo has never dipped into before, and very rarely since. So despite a lackluster look, the concept behind this guy is well deserving of the top 15. Speaking of great conceptual scares, the Beast of Bottomless Lake is probably the most slept on monster in this series. I never see anyone talking about this guy, but the abandoned lake town and the interrupted camping trip vibes throughout the episode are immaculate. Maybe I'm letting my own past experiences get the better of me here, but if you've ever spent a lot of time in this kind of small camp town, you know how uneasy the whole place can be. Add on to that the setup of the creature's eyes glowing just under the surface of the water. That's chilling and has unlocked a whole new fear anytime I'm on a lake. Honestly, this is a brilliant way to build tension and draws on the inherent fear of the ocean and the monstrosities that call it home. The beast has a lot of deep sea inspirations, but has a more coherent design than the creepy heat, with a stronger base concept that the episode uses to brilliant effect. The episode does get a bit monotonous near the end, so I'll deduct points as necessary, but everything about this episode, from the campground setting to the unearthly lights, builds an amazing episode that deserves way more love. Alright, those were 2 longer ones, but this next one is pretty short and sweet. A large and isolated mansion on Halloween night is a cheat code for horror, and an early mention of the famous Crane family gives us some horror by association from the very beginning. So it's no wonder that the Headless Horseman is so beloved and feared in the fanbase. I've talked in more detail previously about why headless monsters are scary, but honestly it's such a basic fear that I don't feel like it needs to be explained. The reason that Old Pumpkin Face is this low is because of this scene right here. I'll acknowledge that if you're thoroughly engrossed in the narrative, the idea of someone actually having their head stolen and transplanted onto this terror is chilling, but this breaks the illusion entirely for me. From this moment on, it's painfully obvious that Elwood is behind the scheme, and the Headless Horseman loses any scare factor. And now, following the footsteps of the Ghost Clown, we get our second of 3 monsters that use the hypnosis gimmick in this show. Of course, previously I drew a dichotomy between Scared-A-Lot and Camelot that uses it more comedically and works against itself, and Bedlam and the Big Top that leans into it, drawing on the loss of control to amplify the scares. The cat creature falls in the latter category, with specifically a medical professional abusing his station to frame an innocent old woman as a feline felon stalking the night. This episode is a psychological horror, and the scene of Aunt Olivia insisting on her innocence as she tosses and turns in her nightmare is spine-chilling. As a side note, The people who live in this building should be way more concerned with all of the H.H. Holmes-style secret passageways built into their home, and the episode should have relied on that a lot more. Honestly, if you want to drop the cat creature by a couple of slots, I can't blame you, but the sheer ruthlessness of Dr. Bell, combined with just how hard the episode works to convince us that Olivia really is the cat creature, that just resonates with me. I think that it works really well. Now let's talk about a true classic, the pterodactyl ghost. A lot of you will be upset that he's placed so low, and I get it. The canyon is a pretty unique setting, and while we've had prehistoric poltergeists before, the pterodactyl is just such a striking design that we have to give him major props. But there are a few detractors for me. For starters, man, I'm so tired of caves in Scooby-Doo. They show up in at least 14 episodes of this show alone, and at a certain point you just run out of ways to make them interesting. But I'm also not convinced of how scary this guy is. Unique? Absolutely. Striking? 100%, but scary? Keep in mind that I'm only considering this episode, not Monsters Unleashed, which does a great job of showcasing the design in live action, but I'm honestly split about how well he works here. I've put him this high because he does meet all of our criteria, and I know a lot of people really love him, and I do see it, but I just don't think I can put him any higher in good faith. Someone that I am very comfortable with having this high, however, is our number 10 pick, the Ghostly Gondolier. This is another really slept-on episode, but let's start with the character design. I really like the colors used here. They're not the usual classic Scooby greens, but still manage a very effective palette. And the manic face peering out from under the pitch black hood is so frightening. This is also another episode that makes really good use of the fog, especially with this scene where the gondolier is fading in and out from the foggy background. That's so good. With 1970s technology, this was a really ambitious shot, and I'm so glad that it worked out. The whole medallion plotline isn't my favorite. It's kind of distracting like a lot of weird season 3 episodes, but there are enough great moments to make up for it. I love this one where the gondolier's shadow falls over Daphne before he abducts her. That is classic horror movie, and I love seeing Scooby-Doo dip into this well. It's not perfect, which is why the gondolier is only a 10, but this just goes to show how much a few great jump scares can elevate an episode. Next up is the Moon Monster. So, full disclosure, I didn't watch this episode until I was in my early 20s, and the first time the Moon Monster showed up on screen, I got goosebumps. There's something about this guy's face and the way he howls that just gets under my skin. Following in the Mummy of Anka's footsteps, the Moon Monster can turn people to stone. But this shot where the gang finds Uncle Chin turned into a statue with the monster lurking behind him menacingly, that's horrific. It's like he's gloating or showing off his newest victim. This is another culture-bound monster to a degree, but the monstrous face, hulking frame, and true threat if he gets his hands on you sets the Moon Monster apart in my book. Next up is going to go to the Gator Ghoul. There's a lot that can be said about this guy, but let's be real. He's a bipedal alligator. That's horrific all on its own. Throw that crime against nature into a swamp filled with run-down, dilapidated buildings, and build the setup of his gleaming eyes in the dark of the swamp, and you get a ridiculously effective monster. I mean, just check out this first moment that he comes on screen. That's so good. Some people might call me out on double standard here, because there's some similarities between the Gator Ghoul and the Ape Man or Jaguaro, but part of the effect comes from having a very bestial animal like an alligator and giving him an uncannily humanoid form. The Phantom Racer is a terrifying monster. I love the concept behind this whole episode, drawing on the fear of driving down a dark, deserted road. For a lot of people, their vehicle is kinda a safe space, a bubble of security. I've talked about this previously, but the episode flips that idea on its head by having entire vehicles disappear, and then it shows us what happened to those drivers. Getting to see him show up confused and disoriented after being a victim of the Phantom Racer is so unsettling. It would have been really easy to just leave them as kidnapping victims, but This scene elevates this monster to a whole new level. I know a few people who have had their nightmares haunted by this guy, and I can't blame them. And finally, in 6th place, is the no-face zombie. Now this guy is horrific. This shambling, moaning, stalking, limping, faceless nightmare looks like something that would make R.L. Stine soil his drawers. And based on merits of the monster design alone, he could very well have taken the gold. The problem is, this episode kinda sucks. It's good for the first half or so. I love the moment where the gang looks over and sees the zombie driving next to them. That's a great scare. But from the moment we meet the gorilla, it's not just going downhill, it's crashing and burning at record speed. The toy factory really isn't that spooky and feels more like Willy Wonka than Hasbro, with a machine that can literally duplicate a living, breathing dog. And the gorilla just makes no sense. The fact that this was the real costume, despite the no-face zombie being one of the best monster designs in Scooby-Doo history, is just unforgivable. It should speak to how chilling this animatronic is that he's up this high when the episode is, honestly, a travesty. And then there were 5. The 10,000 volt ghost, the ghost of Dr. Coffin, Gramps the Vamp, the Tar Monster, and Old Iron Face. Man, what an iconic gallery of ghouls. It's a shame that we can't give the win to all 5 of them, but that's not how this works. So let's start by eliminating the weakest of the 5, Gramps the Vamp. And when I say weak, understand that I only mean relatively weak, because this guy is still a spine-chilling specter. Despite being a vampire, he manages to sidestep the plainer disguises that other vampires have had with a more monstrous face, and this absolutely amazing setting elevates him. It checks all of the boxes: isolated, associated with death and horror, dangerous. This episode has great pacing and one of the single best moments of showing off what the monster can do to its victims in the franchise. When Lisa picks up the phone and is transformed into a vampire herself, ooh, that is chilling. It's always spooky to see a friend of the gang turned against them, and similar to Dr. Bell, Uncle Leon using hypnosis to control her this way is even scarier once the mask is pulled off. Although personally, the moment that gets me even more than this is when Daphne answers the phone and we're treated to this shock still of Gramps on the other end as the ringing noise plays. Scooby villains aren't generally very multidimensional, and you can usually figure out exactly what they're trying to do anytime they show up. This isn't the case here. This baffling moment mixed with the utter silence of the vampire makes my skin tingle in a way that only the horror of the gaps really can. This moment only works because we have no idea what Gramps wants. But beating him out by just a bit, and believe me, these two were probably the closest in the entire video, is Old Iron Face. It's probably not a surprise at this point that I'm not a big fan of these kinds of just a man ghosts, but I feel that the Iron Mask does double duty here. First, it obscures the face in a similar way to ghosts like Captain Cutler or even the Space Kook. Obscuring the face always makes a design read as less humanoid, more monstrous. But second, that backstory. I love the prison island setting already, and similar to the Minor 49er, this is a design that might be subpar otherwise, but in the right setting, it works like a charm. The fact that they outright say that the mask was welded onto the prisoner's face is way too gruesome for Scooby-Doo. The design may err on the side of simplicity, but it is ridiculously effective in context. I do wish that the sharks weren't so obviously mechanical, but Season 3's gotta do what Season 3's gotta do. Even with that though, the shark jet ski concept is so unique and gives this monster a different kind of terror, a sort of baffling and bewildering edge to it. So if you think that Gramps should be in 4th instead of Iron Face, I can totally see it, but I have to give Mama Mione the slightest edge between the two. We're getting closer and closer to the end, and I know I'm gonna upset some people with this one, but the bronze medal is going to the 10,000 volt ghost from What a Shocking Ghost. I love when the monster is the ghost of someone real, at least real in the world of Scooby-Doo, and not just this vague specter like Where Are You's Phantom or Black Knight. And the fact that Voltner is so recently dead makes the monster feel all the more real. It's another monster that just fits into its setting so perfectly. I love when that happens. And we also get one of the most visceral threats in the series, with a monster who could off the gang with a single touch. We even see him melting an iron lock at the very beginning of the episode. I think this whole episode just works together so perfectly. There's no part out of place. The flashback, the abandoned setting, even the design of the 10,000 volt ghost. Sure, it's a bit vague, but I think that's the point. This monster doesn't have a concrete physical form. This is actually one of the few times that I think the Monsters Unleashed version was a bit of a downgrade, although it's still really good. My only nitpick, and it is absolutely a nitpick, is that I wish the background in this episode were darker. At a certain point, you have to sacrifice realism for readability in a cartoon, and I absolutely get that, but it's supposed to be a blackout. And I think there's a sweet spot where the background can be darker without being completely inscrutable. And now, drumroll please, the second scariest monster in all of the Scooby-Doo show is the Tar Monster. Now, I know that the Tar Monster is beloved by the fan base, and with good reason, so a lot of you are probably upset that he's not at number 1. Let me cover what works about him, and I promise that I have good justification for having him in this place instead of first. For starters, look at him. He's terrifying. Just put yourself in this scene. You're working on this archaeological dig, and you wake up in the middle of the night to answer nature's call. You look out at one of the tar pits, associated by nature with death and decay, and you see a slow lump rising out of the tar. Maybe in the dark you even assume at first that your eyes are just playing a trick on you. But then, as the tar drips off, you see that blood-red mouth and that green cyclopean eye peering at you out of the dark. Is it a bit of editorializing? Maybe. But I do feel like this is exactly how we're supposed to read this monster. That's what's implied by the setup of the episode. The drippiness serves to break up the design a bit and makes it look less like just a giant blob. And the deep blue shadows are just a chef's kiss for the whole design. But for a standout moment, I have to turn to the tent scene with Shaggy and Scooby. Being in a tent can be really scary if you think about it, because there's just a very small bit of fabric separating you from anything out there that might want to do you harm. I love that this episode took advantage of this and wrung that scene for all the scares it was worth. Everything about the Tar Monster is just absolutely stellar, and I can't imagine him not being at or near the zenith of Scooby Monster potential. But there is a single monster that I think works even better than him, and that is the ghost of Dr. Coffin. Now I'll go ahead and say that this guy is far less iconic than the Tar Monster, the 10,000 volt ghost, or even Iron Face. But come on, man. Let me run you down the list for this episode. The gang gets lost on a rainy night, so we're immediately vulnerable and isolated. We've got an abandoned sanitarium, which is just beyond chilling. Tewksbury makes a comment about his patients keep going missing, which is alarming on so many levels. We have a pretty well-explored setting and spooky organ music that rings out in the middle of the night. Even the design is just perfect. Mad doctors are a common trope for a reason, and the ghoulish face combined with the torn medical garb and the eerie laugh plays everything up so perfectly. But if you're not convinced, let me give you a trio of moments that, to me, solidify Dr. Coffin's place as the scariest monster in the series. First is the scene where Daphne and Velma wake up to see patients being loaded into the ambulance. That is so eerie, and it honestly makes me wonder if this episode should have been censored a bit more. I'm a grown man, and I watched this episode in the middle of the day, but this moment still made me feel uncomfortable. Another moment that made my heart race was this window jump scare. I don't know, the setting is just so good at building tension, and the fact that Freddy and Shaggy react to the jump scare is formula breaking in the same way that the Puppet Monster's prompter box scare was. But the most visceral of the scares in this episode was actually a bit subtler. The secret passageways throughout the building. A hospital is a naturally very sanitized and almost dehumanized setting, and a hospital room is such an impersonal place. But there's still some sense of privacy and protection to it. Having these secret passageways that connect the rooms robs you of that privacy and leaves just a feeling of vulnerability, like you can never truly be safe. It's not a jump scare, but it is a level of terror that seeps into the entire episode, bringing it to new heights. So I can confidently say that the ghost of Dr. Coffin is the single scariest monster in all of the Scooby-Doo show. As always, please keep in mind that these are my personal opinions. I do my best to back them up, but at the end of the day, fear is personal and subjective, and I want to hear your opinion. If you think that the ghost of Finian McDuff or the Jaguaro is the best monster, let me know why. Because it can never be a bad thing to take a moment and think more critically about the media we consume and the judgments that we make. This is Singularity, and remember to stay curious.